The great heroes of the 20th century have been giants of the human spirit. Men who were not concerned with wealth or power, but with the soul of man. Men who lived and sometimes died in defense of human freedom. Men who had one great concern, the dignity of the human person. Today we enter the lives of three such men. Pope Leo XIII brought the teachings of Christ to bear on the problems of an industrial society. Pope Pius X, who sparked the spiritual renaissance now so evident in the Christian world, and Pope Pius XII, who did so much to alleviate the sufferings of mankind in the Second World War.
Insight, an exploration in depth of the spiritual conflicts of the 20th century. Insight.
Hello, I'm Father Kieser. The 20th century has produced many champions of the human spirit. Jacques Maritain, Mahatma Gandhi, Karl Barth, Cardinal Mindszenty, Tom Dooley, Martin Buber, Visser Tucht, Whittaker Chambers, Martin Niemöller. These spiritual warriors differ in many ways. Some are Christians, Protestant or Catholic. Others are Jewish or Hindu. Some have white skin. Others are brown or black. And yet, regardless of their race or religion, all of these men have one thing in common: a deep, wholehearted conviction that each member of the human race bears within himself the image of God. Because of this, each individual has dignity, he has rights, he's possessed of infinite value. Today we enter the lives of three men who were filled with this conviction. We have chosen them not only because of their individual greatness, but because they headed an institution which has for centuries preached a doctrine which champions spiritual freedom and the rights of the individual. Let us now look in on Pope Leo XIII, the first pontiff of the Catholic Church in the 20th century.
Your Holiness, I have here a copy of your encyclical letter, Rerum Novarum. Now, I must tell you it has shocked many people. It's embarrassed others, and in some quarters it's being called an ecclesiastical bombshell. Would you consider it so?
No, not really. Its principles are not new. You'll find them all in the Gospels. I've merely tried to project the teachings of Christ into the 20th century.
Well, then you had a definite reason for writing this encyclical at this particular moment in history.
Very definitely. I look at the great industrial centers of the world, in Italy, in France, in Germany, in America, in England, and I find men and women laboring in mines from sunup till sunset under conditions of virtual slavery in what are commonly called sweatshops. I see women and children doing work tutors for men in the midst of what should be a beneficent industrial expansion. I find the human spirit being stifled. I wrote my encyclical in the hope of remedying this situation.
And you know, in reading it, I was impressed with your concern for the poor and the exploited.
Thank you. I try in my own way to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. I try to help those who need it most.
Is this an official policy of your church?
Definitely. The church has always been for all. That is why she is called Catholic. But in a very special way, the church is for the poor. And if I am to be a good pope, I must be a pope of the poor.
Do you mind if I ask you a very candid question?
Not at all, my son. Ask anything you like.
Well, in your encyclical, I find that you discuss wages and prices, labor unions, working conditions. Now, many of our political leaders say this is no business of the church. They say that you should concern yourself with the things of God and forget about economic problems.
How can you divorce the two? Certainly these are economic problems, my son, but they are also human problems. They concern man's rights, his freedom, his dignity. And that is why the church cannot remain indifferent to them.
Well, now, do you think that sweatshops and slums and inadequate wages can affect an individual's relationship to God?
Oh, I most certainly do. How can a man pray if his body is exhausted by overwork, his mind troubled by worry, his heart embittered by injustice? It's hard, my son, very hard. Almost too much to hope for.
Now, let me understand you correctly, Your Holiness. You want an ideal society where everybody could be perfectly happy?
No, I'm afraid that's not possible. Even the most perfect social conditions could not content man. Each of us has been made for the face-to-face vision of God. That is our salvation. Nothing short of that will make us perfectly happy.
Well, now, the communists would disagree with you. They criticize you for turning man's energies from the world to reach some illusionary castle in the sky. Now, is there any truth in this?
The communists criticize me for many things. Perfect happiness is to be found in the next life, that's for certain. But it can only be gained by doing the will of God in this life, and that means work.
And then you see an essential value to work.
Oh, I most certainly do. Work is good for man. It activates his mind and heart. It enables him to express himself. Christ has set the example here. For many years, you must remember, he worked as a carpenter.
You know, the communists also criticize you for defending private property.
I know. I know. They want to take away from the worker the fruits of his own labor. I consider this contrary to the very nature of man. I consider it against the law of God.
Then you do consider private property a right?
I do.
Can you tell us why?
Well, an individual has a right to the products of his own work. He has a duty to support his own family. How can he do this without private property?
Now, do you see any other advantages to private property?
Oh, yes. It stimulates the initiative. It encourages men to assume responsibility. It enhances his dignity, and that is good. Very good.
Do you feel that private property is an unlimited right?
No, not an unlimited right. The ownership of property is private, but it must be used for the benefit of society.
I don't quite understand.
Well, a man is obliged to use his property to support his family and to provide for its future. And once he has done that, he should use its resources to help those who are less fortunate. He must do what he can to assist those who are in need.
I notice, Your Holiness, that in your encyclical, you condemn communism.
That is correct.
Well, can you tell us the reason? You know, many people in Western Europe seem to be very, very sympathetic to these new ideas.
I'm afraid they are naive. You see, Marx saw the abuses of capitalism, but he tried to solve them with erroneous philosophic premises. His solution to the problems created by the Industrial Revolution is not only impractical, it's inhuman.
Do you think that the Christian social principles outlined in the encyclical are the answer to communism?
I do. Humbly and with all my heart. I believe they are the only answer.
Well, now, do you think that they can check the spread of communism?
I think they can destroy communism. But these principles must be put into practice. Yes, that is the big thing. They must be put into practice.
Pope Leo XIII was a man many years ahead of his time. His encyclical Rerum Novarum, meaning of new things, was written in 1892. And yet its principles and insights are as applicable today as they were when Pope Leo first articulated them. Here in the United States, its principles have been widely adopted by officials of both labor and management. They have deeply influenced the economic thinking of both major political parties. In Europe, much the same has been the case. The Christian democratic movement, which has done so much to strengthen Western Europe against communism and create its present prosperity, looks upon Rerum Novarum as its founding charter. Konrad Adenauer in Germany, Robert Schuman and Charles de Gaulle in France, De Gasperi and Fanfani in Italy are all indebted to the ideas of Pope Leo XIII. Is it surprising that an economic doctrine of such magnitude should come from a spiritual leader? I don't think so. The English word pope comes from the Latin word papa, meaning father. And the Pope under God is the spiritual father of mankind. And so in a very real sense, like all good fathers, Pope Leo was deeply concerned with the welfare of his children. He was primarily concerned with their souls. But like Christ, he also recognized the importance of the body. He knew then, as we know today, that spiritual growth is hardly possible in a climate of destitution and injustice. This is why he sought to keep social progress apace with economic progress, and why he wanted to assure to each individual the material possessions necessary to maintain his dignity and exercise his freedom. 25 years before the Russian Revolution, Pope Leo XIII pointed out the errors of Karl Marx. He warned the world of communism and instituted special prayers for the Russian people. But he knew that it was not enough to reject communism. The problems created by the Industrial Revolution are still with us. They can be solved only by the application of the Christian social principles propounded by this great Christian leader. Pope Leo XIII died in 1903. Let us now look in on his successor, Pope Pius X.
Your Holiness, would you mind telling us something about your early life? I've heard it said that you as a boy took off your shoes and walked to school barefoot in order to save shoe leather. Now, is this a true story?
Oh, yes. My father was a poor man, a janitor, in Riesa in northern Italy. 15 lira a month was little enough on which to raise a family even in those days. And what are shoes to a peasant boy when he can walk barefooted? I enjoyed those walks in the country and that beautiful countryside. I had plenty of time to think.
When did you
to
first
meditate.
think of becoming a priest, Your Holiness?
I don't recollect just when I first thought of it. I know I was very young at the time.
How did your parents react to the idea?
My father was not what you would call overjoyed.
You mean he opposed the idea?
At first. Later he gave his consent willingly.
What made him change his mind?
The grace of God, I believe, and my mother. My dear mother could change anyone's mind.
Well, now you were young, a healthy boy. Wasn't marriage one of your dreams?
I can't say that it was. Marriage is a holy state. It can bring great joy, great happiness. I'd seen that in my own home. But I didn't consider it to be my vocation. I always believed that God had something else in store for me. You see, I was so sure, so very sure that he wanted me to be a priest.
Is that the final criterion of a vocation to the priesthood? I mean, the will of God?
Oh, yes, it must come from God. Only he can issue the invitation. We choose him only after he has first chosen us.
What kind of an invitation is this?
I would say it was an invitation of a unique sort to friendship with God. An invitation to sacrifice one's life and all one's energies in his service. An invitation to serve him living through other people.
I would imagine you'd call this invitation something special.
Oh, yes. All men are called to the friendship of God, but not all men are called to be priests.
Where were you sent after your ordination?
I was assigned to a parish in Tombolo, a farming community of about 1,000 souls.
What were your duties there?
My duties at Tombolo were to see to the education of the people.
And, of course, education is very important.
Spiritual growth is all but impossible without knowledge. Every man has a mind. He must feed it upon the truth. My work at Tombolo was to bring the truth of God to the people, to show them the way to God.
But what is the way to God?
Christ is the way to God, my son. We go to the Father through him.
I see. Now, would you mind telling me what your ultimate aim was, Your Holiness? I mean, what you were trying to accomplish?
Just what every priest tries to accomplish. I tried to bring the people closer to God. I tried to bring God into the lives of the people.
Well, now, I understand you were made a bishop in 1884, and then Pope Leo XIII made you a cardinal in 1893. What exactly are the duties of a cardinal?
Well, the cardinals serve as the Pope's advisors. When the Pope dies, it is they who elect his successor.
What were your thoughts when Pope Leo XIII died?
I was greatly saddened. Leo was a brilliant and a holy man. I knew we would have great difficulty in finding a successor of like caliber.
Mm-hmm. When you left Venice and traveled to Rome for the election, did you have any idea that you might be the next pope?
Not the slightest. I had my return ticket to Venice in my pocket.
Well, would you have wanted to be pope?
No, at the time, I think not.
Why?
The papacy is a position of the greatest and gravest responsibility. It requires great abilities, great gifts. I felt that I had neither the intellectual capacity nor indeed the sanctity to fulfill its duties.
Do you mind if I ask you a very personal question, Your Holiness?
Oh, please, please.
Have your fears about accepting the responsibilities of the papacy materialized?
It's strange, you know, but God has a way of making up for our shortcomings. He never imposes a task upon you without giving you the strength and the insight that it demands.
How do you look upon your role as the Pope?
You mean, what do I think a Pope should be?
Mm-hmm.
Ah, that's a big question. Quite a question. One that I've often asked myself. Christ our Lord, you know, called himself the Good Shepherd. And after he laid down his life for his sheep, he made Peter the first pope and said to him, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep." That is the function of the Pope.
Your authority then comes from Christ.
Oh, yes. Without authority from Christ, I would have no authority at all.
Is he the one who makes you infallible?
It is only the Spirit of Christ that protects the Pope from error.
How does it feel, Your Holiness, to be infallible? To know that everything you say must be true?
Please, let us not exaggerate this question of infallibility. The Pope is infallible only when certain special conditions are present.
What are they?
Well, in the first place, he must be speaking as the head of the church. And then his subject must be restricted to faiths or morals. And he must use his infallible power, intend to use his infallible power, to define a doctrine to be held by the universal church.
Mm-hmm. Is there some special reason that Christ gave this power to the head of the church?
Oh, yes, I think every Christian wants to know what Christ wants him to believe, what Christ wants him to do to save his soul. Christ made the Pope infallible in these matters and only in these matters, so that all men everywhere might have that certainty. Otherwise, no one would know what Christ taught. The unity of the church would be broken. The result would be religious anarchy.
Does this give you the power to add to Christ's teachings or to change them?
Oh, of course not. How can you change God's truth? I think the Spirit of Christ has been understood more completely and interpreted more accurately as the years have passed, but it has not been changed, it has not been added to. That is not the function of the church.
Well, now, does Christ protect the Pope from sin as well as from error?
I think Christ protects all men from sin with his grace. But the Pope does not enjoy any absolute protection in this regard. The Pope is infallible under certain conditions, but he is not impeccable. He, too, must struggle with temptation. He goes to confession, too, you know.
One final question, Your Holiness. Would you restate the aim of your pontificate?
My aim is to restore all things in Christ. That is what I want to do. That is the only thing worth doing. To restore all things in Christ.
To live for Christ, to work for Christ, to serve as the instrument of Christ. This is the ideal of every Christian. It is the role of the church. It's the desire of every pope. For the life of the Christian is centered about Christ. It is Christ's doctrine he believes. It is Christ's life he lives. It is Christ's will he seeks to accomplish. It is Christ's love he carries into the world. The Christian community is the body of Christ, and the members of that community are bound together by the Spirit of Christ. The Pope, the visible head of that community, is the representative of Christ on earth. In St. Gregory's beautiful phrase, he is the servant of the servants of God. He does not exist for himself. He exists to serve Christ living in others. He possesses special powers only that he may serve them more fully. During the ceremony of a pope's coronation, a monk approaches the new pope, holds a lighted candle to his face, and blows it out. While he does so, he says, "Sic transit gloria mundi," so passes the glory of the world. Pope Pius X exemplifies in both words and actions the true functions of a pope. He brought Christ to the people, and he brought the people to Christ. And in the process, he found Christ himself. We know this pope today as St. Pius X. But let us look now on a more recent occupant of St. Peter's chair, a man whom many of us remember. Our next guest is Pope Pius XII.
Your Holiness, the years of your pontificate have been troubled ones. What's been your policy? I mean, what have you worked for?
More than anything else, my son, I've worked for peace. Because I have lived in a time of war, I have spent my energies working for peace.
Well, I know that on many occasions you tried to get the nations to put down their arms, to discuss, negotiate, but you failed.
Yes, I have failed, I'm afraid. Peace is a many-sided jewel. So few understand that peace is the tranquility of order. It must start not at the conference table, but in the heart of man. We will not have an international peace until men return to God. Peace, you see, is a work of justice, and God alone is the source of justice.
But don't you think disputes between nations are inevitable?
Disputes may be inevitable, but they need not be settled by force. They can be settled by moral principle, by justice and charity.
You'd favor, then, negotiation and arbitration?
I would. St. Augustine said it is more glorious to kill war through words than to kill men through iron.
Have you been involved in any such negotiation?
Yes, I have. For many years, I was in the Vatican diplomatic service. I was Pope Pius XI, Secretary of State. And prior to that, I was apostolic delegate to Germany.
Were you in Germany when Hitler came to power?
Yes. Yes, I was there.
What did you think of the Nazi movement?
What could I think of it? I had read Mein Kampf. I had listened to Hitler's speeches. I was most distressed by his rise to power.
Did you make known your opinions?
I made no attempt to conceal them. I had a duty to speak out. I delivered 44 major addresses during my stay in Germany. In 40 of them, I dwelt upon the errors of Nazism.
But many people, apparently good people, were taken in by the Nazis. Why were you so opposed to them?
I was opposed to them because of their contempt for human dignity, because of their disregard of the individual's rights, because of their warlike intentions, because from the beginning they sought to exterminate Christianity. I found their anti-Semitism particularly galling.
Did you see any connection between Nazism and communism?
Yes, I do. A very deep one. Both are atheistic philosophies of life which seek to destroy the dignity of man. Both produce totalitarian states in which the individual's rights are denied. The Church has condemned both Nazism and communism.
Once Italy entered the war, I suppose that your activities were pretty much curbed.
Oh, yes, in many ways they were. During those war years, we concentrated our attention on helping those who had been victimized by the war.
In just what way?
We set up refugee camps. We established hospitals for the victims of the bombings. We organized food convoys for famine-stricken areas. We ran an information service for displaced persons. It enabled them to locate their relatives.
In how many countries were you and your church active?
I think 40 in all. We worked from Finland to South Africa, from Belgium to Hong Kong.
But there were few Catholics in Finland.
But there were human beings there, human beings in need. That can be the only criterion for charity.
Were you able to do anything for the Jews?
Not as much as we would have liked, but we did all we could. During the Nazi occupation of Rome, the chief rabbi was summoned by the Gestapo and told he must pay 1,000,000 lira and 100 pounds of gold, or see the extermination of his people.
Was the rabbi able to raise the money and the gold?
He tried. He raised as much money as he could, but he was short much of the gold.
What did you do?
I gave it to him.
Where'd you get it?
I ordered the Vatican treasurer to melt down our religious vessels.
Were the Nazis satisfied?
Only for a time. The Gestapo took over and began deporting the Jews.
Were you able to help?
Well, I protested to the authorities. We denounced the policy in a Salvatore Romano. We hid as many of the Jewish people as possible in our churches and monasteries throughout Italy.
Could you say how many you were able to conceal?
About 5,000, I think. But it wasn't enough, never enough. Others, so many others were arrested. We never heard from so very many of them after that.
And now that the war is over, Your Holiness, I suppose that you rest easier.
No, I can't say I do. I'm glad hostilities have ceased, but still there is no real peace.
What do you mean?
Well, look at the map of Europe. Look at the map of Asia, an iron curtain. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, China, Russia, Mongolia, Manchuria. The peoples of these countries are enslaved. Their rights are denied. Their dignity is degraded. No. I'm afraid I don't rest easy. I'll never rest easy as long as there are men who are not free to worship God.
Pope Pius XII could not rest easily because men were being enslaved and human dignity was being violated. Neither can you or I, because men are still being enslaved and human dignity is still being violated. The inhabitants of East Berlin, Warsaw, Leningrad, Budapest, Havana, Peking, Hanoi have the same dignity and the same rights as we do. We can't remain indifferent to their plight. We cannot rest content while these men are enslaved, their rights denied, their dignity compromised. Let us all, whether we be Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish, close ranks behind our spiritual leaders. Let us dedicate our energies to the defense of human rights. Let us march together to safeguard the dignity of man. And let us all struggle, suffer, and if necessary, for the freedom of the human spirit.
Insight is a production of the Paulist Fathers, a group of Catholic priests who serve their God by serving those outside their church.